thank you very much for all being here. It's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be talking to such a distinguished group of investors and entrepreneurs, because all of you guys are making important decisions and judgments every day. And my topic, as you know, when I'm not working with the investment committee of Qualgro, is to teach and research and write books and articles about judgment and decision making. And the book that Eon was talking about, which is the one you see here, is a book about something we call noise, which in fact is, as we sometimes say, the other flaw in human judgment. When I say it's the other flaw, the one that you've all heard about and that you're all familiar with is bias. And we're going to talk about bias and about the difference between bias and noise. But what we've been trying to do with this book, together with Danny Kahneman and Cass Sunstein, who you may know from his book Nudge, is to identify another source of error, another source of bad judgments that we think deserves just as much attention as bias. And that thing is noise. Now, to bring this to life, I suggest we play a little game. We're going to play two little games, actually. But let me start with the first game. Suppose you go to a big, successful insurance company, one of the best insurance companies in the world, one of the largest, and you go to the underwriting department. That's where they set the price of the insurance policies that they sell, the premiums. So suppose you are a big company with plants that you want to insure against fire, you need a quote, an underwriter will give you the quote. Suppose you are a big bank and you need to get insurance against the risk that a rogue trader is going to lose you $1 billion, that's again something that an underwriter will give you a quote for. And they don't just pull this out of thin air. They use their actuarial tables and they all have years of training and experience and they use the methods and the techniques of the company. So there's an expectation that if you ask two different underwriters in the same company the same question about the same risk, they're going to give you a quote that is reasonably close. Reasonably close. Not identical, because it's a judgment. It's not a formula. It's not a machine. It's a human making a judgment. But reasonably close. My question for you is, how close do you expect it to be? How close do you expect it to be? In percentage of their average, if you pick two underwriters in that very successful company, how much of a difference do you think you would find between the two quotes on the same file? I'm going to ask you to actually answer this question by scanning the QR code, and we're going to see what you collectively think. Okay, it looks like you still have a few phones up in the air. No, not working. Okay, can we see how many results we have? We've got quite a few. Let's see, we've got about half of the people who think it is less than 15%, and half of the people who think it's more than 15%. Now, I have sort of warned you that this would be a big number because I'm telling you this is the subject of the speech. So, more people here err on the direction of 15% than usual, but still, the number that is the median of the group is about 15%. Usually, when we ask insurance professional, it's about 10%. This is the distribution that we get when we ask the people in the business. So they say 10, you say 15, but what is the truth? What actually happens when we run this experiment? What actually happens is that we find 55. When you actually give the same quote request, the same request for a quotation to two different underwriters who are sitting next to each other and who are supposed to be interchangeable, there's actually, on average, half of the time it's more than that. On average, there's a 55% difference between two quotes. This is very troubling if you are the management of the insurance company. The management of the insurance company also told us it shouldn't be more than 10. But in fact, it's a lot more than they think. This is noise. This is the simple idea that whenever we think a judgment is going to be identical or nearly identical, it is in fact highly variable. It is a lot of unwanted variability in judgment. And the first basic idea that I want to share with you tonight is wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and more of it than you think. When I say wherever there is judgment, there is noise, in a way, that's obvious, that's tautological. If you say something is a matter of judgment, it means that it's okay for different people to disagree. If I asked you how much is 6 times 7, you wouldn't say it's a matter of judgment because it's not okay for people to disagree. We all know what the answer is. But when we say something's a matter of judgment, we accept the idea that there is going to be some disagreement. The surprise is that there is a lot of it, a lot more of it than you think. We're going to see some examples in a second. Before we do that, let me highlight, though, the difference between noise and bias. Because we've all become familiar with bias, we've all become familiar with the sorts of errors that we can explain, that we can predict, and there's a simple way to draw an analogy between, to illustrate the difference between noise and bias. Suppose that you are at a shooting range, and a group of friends are using the same gun to shoot at the same target. If you see what you see in team A here, they're all great, perfect, there is no error. If you see team B here, you see that they're all shooting in the same place, and it's the wrong place. That is what we mean when we're talking about a bias. A bias is when we are all making the same mistake. Not exactly the same mistake, but directionally the same mistake. When we're all erring in the same direction. So when you say, for instance, that forecasters have an optimistic bias, it's because on average, they tend to predict something that is more optimistic than what is actually going to happen. Not exactly all the same thing, there may be noise too, but on average there is an error that is directional and predictable. When you say that people are subject to the planning fallacy, meaning that they underestimate the time it will take to complete a project, that's an example of a bias. The direction of the error is predictable. When you have a bias, when you have a shared error like this, you immediately look for an explanation. And the psychological biases that you've heard about are explanations for the shared mistakes that you observe. And by the way, you can actually make a confident prediction. If I asked you here, where is the next shot going to land? It wouldn't be hard to guess that it's going to land in the same place as the first 5. Now contrast this with noise. If you see what team C is showing you here, you don't look for an explanation. It doesn't call for an explanation. There is no explanation except that they are not great shooters, which is not a very convincing explanation. It also does not support a prediction. If you see these 5 shots and I ask you where the 6th shot is going to land, you have no idea. So it's a very different form of error. Bias is a predictable shared error. Noise is an unpredictable random error. And of course, in most real-life situations, you will find something like team D, which is both noisy and biased. You see in team D that you've got the center of gravity of the shots, which is not in the center, and you've got scatter. So how much bias and how much noise do we find in real-life decisions? Let's start with something like judicial decisions. This is an experiment that was done by researchers in the US who asked more than 200 federal judges to look at the same cases, the exact same cases, not similar cases, the exact same cases. And when you look at the sentence that these judges dole out, they basically give sentences that are very, very variable. In some cases, some judges give life in prison and others give 1 year. In some cases, some judges give no prison time at all, others give 15 years. On average, for a 7-year sentence, the median variability is almost 4 years. That's the difference between 5 and 9. Is that justice? Justice that depends on the happenstance of who the judge is that you happen to be in front of? That seems like a bizarre idea of justice. Here's another example also in the world of justice. Asylum seekers in the US. In the same courthouse in Miami, you have 2 judges, more than 2 in fact, but let's just pick 2. Judge 1 admits 88% of asylum seekers into the US. Welcome to America. Judge 2 admits 5%. So, however convincing your case is, however persecuted you've been in your home country, however important it is to you and your family that you're going to be admitted to the US as you seek asylum, the moment that really matters is when a coin is flipped or when some bureaucratic process decides whether you get Judge 1 or Judge 2, because that multiplies or divides your chances of being admitted by 14. That doesn't seem like a very good way to make those decisions. Here's another example. When you go to the doctor, because you probably won't be seeking asylum anytime soon, and I hope you won't be facing a criminal judge in the US, but you might all need to see a doctor. Guess what? In all those specialties, there is ample evidence of massive variability in diagnosis. And in fact, since we wrote the book, we've been getting calls from doctors literally every week. The latest conversation we had was with a bunch of epilepsy specialists in Harvard who said, hey, we'd like to run a study, and we worked with them, and they gave 22 cases to 25 different experts from the epilepsy specialist department in Harvard. How many of the cases gave rise to a unanimous diagnosis? And in how many of the cases, of the 22 cases, were all 25 experts in agreement? 0. There wasn't a single case where they all agreed. In fact, when they showed the same cases to the same doctors, a few weeks later, in 21% of the cases, the doctors changed their decision from epilepsy to no epilepsy, or from no epilepsy to epilepsy. So even the same people looking at the same facts can actually, on 2 different occasions, make different judgments. Here's another example, this time in the world of business. We're all making people decisions all the time, HR decisions. Let's suppose, and we're going to play another little game here, let's suppose that you're in charge of hiring the CEO of a big financial firm, a regional financial firm in the US, but a sizable institution. And you've got a number of candidates. One of them is called Michael Gambardi. Michael Gambardi has a profile, the summary of which you're going to see. I'm going to give you 60 seconds to read that profile, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me how confident you are that Michael Gambardi can be successful. And by successful, I just mean that if he gets the job, he will still be around in 2 years' time. It's not a very high bar. So how confident are you that he will still be around in 2 years' time if he is hired? 100 means you're 100% sure he will still be around. 0 means you're absolutely sure he will not fit the bill. Here's the profile of Michael Gambardi. You've got 60 seconds to read it, and then I will ask you to vote. Okay, let's see how many people have voted. We've got quite a few answers. Yeah, here are the answers. As you can see, they're all over the map. So this is a striking example of noise in HR decisions in the sense that you've all got exactly the same evidence. It's not that you've interviewed Michael on different occasions and you've met a different facet of Michael. It's not that he was in a good mood on the day you met him and a bad mood on the day he met someone else. You're all people who are qualified to make people decisions, to make investment decisions, and to decide on the quality of these people. Some of you think he has 0 chance of being successful, others think he has 100% chances of being successful. And I'm pretty sure that those of you who answered 100 must be looking around asking, who are the crazy people who answered 0? And vice versa. We not only are in complete disagreement, we grossly underestimate how much others are in complete disagreement. By the way, this happens in every group. We've been playing this game with lots of groups, including groups of HR directors, and they have just as much scatter in their judgments as you have. Why is that? Because you pay attention to different things. Even when you're looking at exactly the same facts, you're not looking at the same facts. You're not looking at the same Gambardi because you're looking through your own lenses, through the lens of your own history, of your own experiences, of the people that Michael Gambardi reminds you of. And that means that some of you are paying attention to the positives here, to the green words. He quickly rose, he gets results, he is creative and energetic. But some of you are immediately attracted, are immediately struck by the more negative words, the words in red here. And so depending on what draws your attention, or maybe it's a balance of the two and that gets you somewhere in the middle, depending on what gets your attention, which is a function of your own personal history and backgrounds and values and experiences, you pay attention to different things. In other words, the reason we make different judgments is because we're all different. Now that seems like a platitude, but in fact, it's a very important platitude. Of course we're all different. We usually consider that to be a good thing. We usually consider diversity to be good. We usually consider plurality of opinion to be the basis for sound judgments and for democracy out there. And in fact, what I would like you to come to realize is that That is sometimes true, of course. Diversity is sometimes good. But in matters of professional judgment, where we believe that there is a correct answer, diversity is actually not good news. When you go to two different doctors and one of the doctors tells you, you have cancer, and the other says, no, it's a benign tumor, you don't say, well, diversity is great. You say one of these two guys must be wrong, and perhaps both, by the way. So we need to realize, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, that wherever accuracy matters, noise is a problem. Now, when is noise not a problem? Or rather, when is variability not noise? Of course, there are situations where variation is good, where variation helps, where variation is welcome. Suppose, for instance, that you're talking about matters of taste. Suppose you're talking about whether you prefer Vermeer or Picasso. Well, if you prefer one and I prefer the other, that's fine. It's not a problem. It's about taste. We can disagree. That's one of the situations where we don't need to agree. Then we have situations where it's not just that we don't need to agree, we actually need to disagree. One of the situations is a market. If you're buying a stock on the stock market, and someone is selling that stock to you, you obviously disagree about the underlying value of that stock. You're buying because you think it's worth more than the current price. The person who is selling because she thinks it's worth less than the current price. So you disagree about the underlying value, and that disagreement makes the market, as people sometimes say. There is no trading without disagreement. The reason this is actually a good thing is because there is a market. And that means that in a day, or in a week, or in a year, we will know who was right and who was wrong. The person who made the right call will be rewarded by the evolution of the price. The person who made the wrong call will be punished. And so the market will reward the winners and punish the losers. That disagreement is a variation that is actually followed by selection. Just like in evolution theory, we all know that random variation is necessary because it is the engine of selection. Selection happens after variation. The key here is that there is selection. If there is no selection, variation is not good. Another situation where we want variation is creativity. Suppose, for instance, that you have an R&D team and you are trying to find a vaccine against a new disease. Let's call it COVID-19, for instance. And you say, oh, we have a great idea. Let's use an inactivated virus. And another team somewhere else in the world is saying, oh, we have a different idea. Let's use messenger RNA. Well, it's great that you have different ideas. It's great that you have different companies pursuing them because there again, you're going to have selection. You're going to run tests. You're going to see what works. And if one works and the other doesn't, or if, thankfully in this case, both work, that's great. Because again, variation is followed by selection. The problem of noise is when variation happens in professional judgments where we expect there is a correct answer, where we're making the decision on behalf of an organization. The insurance company underwriters that I was talking about are not competing against each other. They're not in a market. They are making a call on behalf of their organization, and the organization expects them to make the right call. So if two of them disagree about that call, it must be that one of them is wrong, or both. If two doctors give you different diagnoses, again, they are not competing against each other. The fact that they disagree is a problem. And what we don't realize, because so much of our time is spent talking about the importance of diversity and creativity, is that the sort of decisions where we want accuracy are actually much more frequent than the kinds of decisions where we want creativity. Yes, there are situations like the ones on the previous page, but there are also lots of situations. Investment is one example. Hiring is another example. Lots of other things that we do in business are examples of situations where we believe there is a correct answer, and that's why we're thinking so hard about them. And wherever we believe there is a correct answer, we want there to be less noise. By the way, there is a common misconception about noise, which is that it doesn't matter because on average it cancels out. And it's true that on average it cancels out, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. If you are on average in the center of the target, that doesn't mean that any of these shots is correct. If your doctor is diagnosing the correct percentage of cancer in his patients, but he misses your cancer and he misdiagnoses it in someone who doesn't have it, you're not saying what a great doctor, he is right on average. You're saying he's wrong both times. So being okay on average, not having a bias, in other words, is actually not sufficient. To be right on average means to be unbiased. That's good, but it's not sufficient. You also need to be less noisy. In other words, if you want to reduce error, you need to reduce both bias and noise, both the shared error, the mean error, and the random error, the scatter of the judgments, which is noise. Arithmetically, error is actually the sum of the squares of bias and noise, which tells you two important things. First, that they actually don't cancel out. A positive error and a negative error do not cancel out. They add up because you square them. And second, that noise and bias play exactly the same role in the equation. In other words, if you can reduce noise by a unit of x, you will have as much impact on the total error that you're making as you will by reducing bias by the same amount. It's just as important to reduce noise as it is to reduce bias. Yet, we have paid a lot less attention to noise. You've probably not thought much about it until tonight. We've paid a lot of attention to bias, and that's great, we should, but we should also pay attention to noise. The good news is that as soon as we start to pay attention to noise, we can actually do something about it. We can actually reduce noise, and by the way, when we do, that will probably reduce bias too. Because the way to reduce noise and to reduce bias is to essentially put the decision process under control. It's to basically practice what we call decision hygiene. Before I talk to you about decision hygiene, let me open a parenthesis for a second and talk about another way that people reduce noise sometimes, which is to say, oh, I get it. Wherever there is human judgment, there is noise. So let's eliminate human judgment, and that way there will be no noise. By the way, that works. It's true that wherever there is no human judgment, there will be no noise. It's, in fact, the only way to eliminate noise completely because, as I've said, wherever there is human judgment, there is going to be noise. Obviously, that also creates a lot of other problems. One of those problems is algorithmic bias, which you've heard about. Other problems are much more practical and much less politically sensitive. It's simply that it's very, very hard to build an algorithm to make a strategic, rare, important decisions. We can build algorithms to make routine decisions if you've got a lot of data to base them on, but to build an algorithm that invests in startups, I haven't seen anyone who can do that, and I venture that it's going to be a long time before you can successfully do that. Some people claim to do that, but in fact, that's not what they're doing. They're sorting decks using algorithms, which you can do, and presumably the algorithm will find some regularities that are easy to identify. But to actually make the right calls in important decisions using algorithms is quite hard. So what we would like to do is to have the noiselessness of algorithms to be as noise-free as algorithms without actually losing the human judgment. Not just because of the difficulty of building algorithms, but also because in some decisions we actually want to have humans in front of us. When we are in front of a judge, we wouldn't like to be in front of a machine. When we are in front of a doctor, we wouldn't like to be in front of a machine. So we want human judgment, but we also want that judgment to be less noisy. How do we do it? The basic idea here is what we call decision hygiene, which is a slightly off-putting term, and we mean it that way, in the sense that we want this to feel a little bit boring, a little bit thankless, because that's what it is. It's just like washing your hands. You know you should wash your hands. Do you have fun washing your hands? No. Will you ever know what disease you avoided by washing your hands? No, you won't. You will never know, here, that was the germ for that disease that I just cleaned up. You will never get that good feeling that you get when you eliminate a bias, when you correct an error that you've identified, because this is prevention. The only way you can eliminate, you can reduce noise, you can put noise under control is through prevention, and decision hygiene is our description of the prevention techniques that you can apply to your decision processes. Basically, putting your decisions under control to make sure that they are less noisy before you make them. You need to work on the process, not to try to correct the decision after it's made. How does it work? I'm going to give you 4 very quick examples. There are more techniques, but I'm just going to pick 4 to try to stay within a reasonable time. First technique is aggregation. And that is the idea that we all intuitively have when we say diversity is good. It is true that for some things, diversity actually helps reduce noise. You probably know the classic wisdom of crowds experiment, where if I asked you all to guess how many jelly beans there are in the jar, none of you would have the correct answer, but the average, the arithmetic mean of your answers would be surprisingly, almost magically close to the correct answer. This was discovered in the first years of the last century by Sir Francis Galton, who was at a country fair, and he asked a few hundred farmers to guess the weight of an ox. And none of them could actually guess the weight of the ox, but the average of their guesses and even the median of their guesses came very, very close to the correct value of the ox. And we can all run experiments like this. Basically, the underlying principle is quite simple. As I've said, noise cancels out. So the random errors, the noisy errors that you're making when you're evaluating the number of jelly beans in the jar are random. And if I take the average of all those random guesses, those errors are going to cancel out. We're going to come very close to the truth. But the reason this works is because you're all making those guesses independently. If we started talking, if one of us said, yeah, I guess it's about 1,000 jelly beans, and the next one said, no, it's less than that, it must be no more than 800, then we would have something that is completely wrong. Because we would have introduced social influence in the process. Wisdom of crowds works only when the inputs are independent and when there is no social influence in the process. And in fact, when we're making decisions in most organizations, we do it completely wrong. Because we do not manage the independence of those inputs, we get in a room and we talk. And when we talk, we don't get independent inputs, we get groupthink. This is very important because we think we are getting the benefit of diversity by getting together and talking about the candidate we've all met, or getting together and talking about the investment that we've all studied, or getting together and talking about whatever judgment we need to make. But in fact, we're making things worse, not better, because we are adding social influence to the process. As an analogy, imagine that you are a detective investigating a case, and you've got a number of suspects, and you've also got several witnesses who saw the crime. You have a lineup of suspects, and you're going to show the suspects to the witnesses. Are you going to bring all the witnesses in the room together and ask them to discuss who is the suspect? Of course not. You're going to bring the witnesses one by one and separately, independently ask them to identify the correct suspect out of the lineup. And if the same suspect is identified independently by all the witnesses, you will be confident that he is in fact the guy who did it. But if you brought all the witnesses in the room and let them have a conversation, you would know that you've polluted the process, and in fact, the jury would probably say, what a silly mistake that you've made during the investigation is inadmissible evidence. Yet, when we're making decisions in our organizations, that's what we do all the time. And I would like you to step back and ask yourselves, why is it that what seems obvious in the context of the detective example seems like something we don't do in business? Or conversely, why do we feel it's more important to talk in business than to get the right answer? I think the answer to that question is because we actually value consensus more than we value getting the correct answer in many situations. And that's a set of priorities that we might want to revisit if we want to improve the quality of our judgments. We might want to become more comfortable with disagreement, more comfortable with noise, more comfortable with the expression of that noise, so that we can actually take advantage of it to get closer to the correct answer by averaging those noisy answers. So that's the first idea. Aggregate, but aggregate independent inputs. If the inputs are not independent, if the people have talked to each other, you've polluted the decision. And I stress that because it can be very subtle. It's not just getting in a room and talking. It can be as subtle as, hey, Hyung, you should really meet this candidate. Here's the resume. As opposed to, hey, Hyung, you might want to meet this candidate. Here's the resume. Right? It's a subtle difference. But Hyung knows exactly how I feel about this candidate. So if you want Hyung's opinion to be independent from mine, you need to really make sure that we don't talk to each other at all and that we document in writing what we think of the candidate before we actually make the decision or start talking. So independence is the first key idea. Second key idea, make relative judgments, not absolute judgments. Relative, not absolute. What does that mean? We are all much better at ranking the length of the 3 vegetables than we would be at measuring the length of one of the vegetables. It's much easier to make comparisons than to make absolute judgments. Why does that matter? Because every time we use words or numbers to describe something, every time we say someone is great, for instance, or the potential of an investment is very high, there is potential for misunderstanding in what different people mean by great or by very high. In this survey, a polling organization asked many Americans, thousands of Americans, what do they mean when they say good or pretty good or great or excellent or awesome or fine or somewhat good? And there's a ranking of those terms, which is probably close to what you would guess. But what you wouldn't guess is that great, which is here, on average means 8.08, but to some people means 5, and to some people means 10. So we could be in agreement that a candidate is great on whatever dimension, or that an investment is great on whatever dimension, but one of us might think that great is the top 1%, whereas the other thinks that great is the top 50%. Now, where we're going to be in less disagreement is if we compare that investment or that candidate to other investments and other candidates. We will be less noisy in comparing than we are in rating. It's much better to rank, to compare, than to evaluate separately or grade. Third idea, and you're going to see that we start to combine the previous ones, is to structure judgments into separate dimensions, into separate components. Here, the term we use is mediating assessments, which is really a way of saying what are the subcomponents of the judgment you're making. If you're hiring a candidate, for instance, you probably have something like a job description that says, I want this person to have this set of skill and this type of experience and this type of personality, etc. If you don't, you might want to try. And once you have that, which is easy, the hard part is to evaluate those dimensions separately from each other. What we tend to do when we're in an interview, for instance, is to have an interview with the candidate, and when we like the candidate, we're going to say, oh, that candidate has a great fit with the corporate culture, that candidate is also very smart, and that candidate is also very experienced, and that candidate has exactly the right skills and has the right motivation. If we don't like the candidate, we will give the candidate bad marks on all the dimensions. Our judgment about the candidate will be very polluted by what is called the halo effect, which is this overall impression of the candidate that we have. To structure a judgment is to make it possible for the different dimensions of the judgment to actually be evaluated separately. So here I'll pick an example of how we do it in our investment committee, but before I do that, actually, I'll give you the example that inspired it. When a baby comes to the world, you need to decide if the baby is okay, or if the baby needs help. This used to be a holistic judgment where the midwife or the doctor would say, yeah, he looks okay, or he looks a bit shaky, he needs help. Until an anesthesiologist called Virginia Apgar in the 1950s came up with a list of 5 criteria, which she retrofitted to actually correspond to her name, so she is remembered, which are the appearance, the pulse, the grimace, the activity, and the respiration, and then she defined what scores 0 point, 1 point, and 2 points on each of those dimensions. The beauty of this is that two different doctors might have paid attention to different things. Maybe one doctor was more attentive to the color of the skin, and another one was more attentive to the pulse, and a third one was more attentive to the activity. But now they all have to be attentive to exactly the same things, to give the same weight to those things, to score these 5 things in exactly the same way. And when a baby gets a 7 from one doctor, he also gets a 7 from another doctor. And 7 is fine. 6 is not fine. So that way you have a lot less variability in scoring the health of the newborns than you had before. How do we apply this to investment decisions? Well, in a similar way. And you're going to see here the several ideas that I've been talking about. First, we break down the decision into criteria which are probably not very different from the criteria that any other firm would use. We care, for instance, about the quality of the founder team and about a lot of other things, but we care about the quality of the founder team. You wouldn't be surprised by that. Then we break down again those qualities into different components, like how smart are they, how driven are they, how hungry are they, etc. And then we do the 2 things that I was talking about. First, we have each of the members of the investment committee and the people who've been working on the team evaluate the dimensions separately. So it could be the founders, it could be the quality of the market, etc. But we make separate evaluations so that we can actually take the average of those judgments and leverage a bit of the wisdom of crowds in the small crowd of people who have actually done the work. And second, we actually score this relative to reference cases, relative to the history of cases that we have in our now large and impressive portfolio. So if we say a founder is great, we will have different points of view on what great means. If we say we compare this founder to the group of founders that we all know, and we place that founder in the hierarchy of the founders that we all know on each of the dimensions, we will actually agree much more easily because it's easier to compare than it is to give a grade. It will force us to be lucid about how good the new candidates are relative to the people we have, and that also forces us to raise our bar continuously on how good we want people to be because we're comparing them to a group of people who are already very good. So we use independent judgments, we use comparisons, not ratings, and we use a structured decision. The hardest part, of course, when we do this, and when anybody tries to do a structured judgment, is to, I'm going to skip this one, is to keep intuition at bay. Because we all want to use our intuition, we all want to form a holistic judgment, we all want to come to a conclusion. It's a lot more satisfying. It's a lot more pleasant to have a simple, coherent story in mind and to look for evidence that confirms it than it is to actually look at all the dimensions separately and to say, this investment is great on that score, but not so great on this score, so now we have a difficult decision to make. But that's reality. Reality is messy. Reality is ambiguous. Reality is that some investments are great on some dimensions and not so great on other dimensions, and we need to recognize that ambiguity. So we need to keep the intuitive judgment, the holistic judgment, at bay for as long as we can. Of course, at the end of the process, we will need our gut to confirm that we're right. We will need to make an intuitive judgment, but we want that intuitive judgment to be informed, to be prepared by the separate evaluation on all the dimensions. I'll give you an example of what happens when you don't do that, a cautionary tale of what happens when you trust your intuition, when you think you are being fact-based, but you in fact know stuff you shouldn't know. The man you see here is called Brendan Mayfield, and he was arrested by the FBI many years ago because his fingerprints had been found and identified as belonging to him on a fragment of the bomb that was detonated in a train station in Madrid, killing over 100 people. It just so happens that Brendan Mayfield, who lived on the west coast of the US, had converted to Islam, and in his job as a lawyer was defending Islamist terrorists. But the fingerprint was not his, and he had never set foot in Madrid, and he was innocent. What happened was that the FBI experts, who knew, they claimed they didn't, but they probably knew that he was a perfect match for the suspect, that he fit the bill, that he had the profile of the suspect, let that influence their reading of the fingerprints. Now that is shocking, isn't it? Because the fingerprint is supposed to be a match or not a match. You're supposed to look at the fingerprint and not to be influenced by extraneous information. But it's impossible not to be influenced when you know. How do we know? Because those experiments have been done in many other cases. It's not just one mistake. If you take fingerprint experts and you tell them, look at these fingerprints, but anyway, the guy has confessed already. Or you take another fingerprint expert and you give them the same fingerprints and you say, look at these fingerprints, but the guy has an alibi anyway. Guess what? You're going to find a big difference in the likelihood that the fingerprints are found to be a match, depending on the extraneous information that you give them. So the key here is, if you're a fingerprint examiner, or if you're an investor, you don't want to know what you don't want to know. You don't want to know too much. Even accurate information. It was true that Brendan Mayfield had converted to Islam, and it was true that he was defending Islamic terrorists. But even information that is accurate, that is true, can actually mislead you because it changes your perception of the other items of information to which you would like to pay attention. So manage the information process so that you make it difficult to form an intuition too early. Manage the information process so that you don't know too much, so that you don't know what you don't want to know. That's the fourth idea. There are many more tools of decision hygiene that we could be talking about, but let me stop here and wrap this up by summarizing what we've talked about so we can move on to the panel and you can ask your questions. Three basic ideas. One, wherever there is judgment, there is noise. We haven't been paying much attention to it until now, and what we're trying to do with this book is to raise the profile of noise, to raise attention to noise, to make us all less deaf to noise, because noise is as important as bias, and we've been paying attention to bias but not to noise. Second, contrary to popular belief, noise is bad. Diversity is good in some situations, but that's not the majority of situations. In most professional judgments, diversity is the sign of error, is the sign of a decision process that is not under control, and we should use that diversity to reduce the error, but we should not celebrate that diversity as being the sign of something good. That diversity is the sign that we're not talking about the same things, that we're not making the same judgments, that we're not making judgments with the same criteria on behalf of the organization as we should be. And third, once we become aware of that, once we actually pay attention to noise, once we start measuring noise and paying attention to it, we can actually reduce it, and if we reduce it, we will also reduce bias, and we will also reduce, as a result, total error and make better decisions. So let's start thinking about noise, let's start recognizing noise, let's start paying attention to noise, and now let's start discussing bias, noise, error, and good judgments. Thank you very much for your attention.